Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Tech Chat. Now on today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Nick Mills, who is the General Manager EMEA at CircleCI. So Nick, welcome to the show and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Very welcome. And before we delve into today's topic matter, would you mind just giving our viewers at home a bit of background on yourself and CircleCI?
Yeah, absolutely. So CircleCI is a software platform centered around continuous integration and continuous delivery. So it's really about supporting software teams and enabling them to take the fastest path from idea through code delivery to value creation for the company. So we've got a suite of software tools which enable companies to build, test and deploy code and to confidently ship that change, that code to end users.
Excellent stuff. I feel like you're the man for the job to answer these questions then, so this should be good. So today we're going to be discussing, talking about innovation and risk-taking in the UK tech sector in response to CircleCI's latest research. Now, I wanted to kind of talk about this research here and just kind of understand what really was the objective of CircleCI's 2020 State of Software Delivery study. And really for you, was there anything kind of shocking in there, or did it uncover something about the UK software industry?
Yeah, so I think, maybe just kind of taking a step back for a second on, why CircleCI is in a fairly unique position to produce this report and to provide some of these insights. Mm-hmm. So in providing the software tools that we do, we support over 40,000 organizations globally, several thousand of those in the UK and Europe. We have paid customers in over 66 countries in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Supporting those customers, we have visibility into many tens of thousands of workflows, which are increments of code change shipped through the platform. And that gives us access to over many million data points into how companies are actually managing that software delivery. With that scale, gives us great insight. But it's also important to note that this is real observed data on the platform. So, not survey data, not to kind of question the efficacy of surveys. They obviously are incredibly valuable and play an important role. But this is actual real data from how software teams are shipping code day in, day out. In terms of what we measured, we really focused on four key metrics, which we believe are probably the four most important metrics for any software team to kind of measure and keep in mind. So those are duration, which is the exact length of time it takes for a workflow or a piece of increment of code change to run from commit by the developer through to getting a signal, whether that is a pass or fail, red or green. The second was mean time to recover, which is the average time between when you get a failure to when you then get your next success. We focused on throughput, which is the average number of workflows, or again, units of code shipped per day, and success rate, which is then the number of successful workflow runs divided by the total number of workflow runs. They were the kind of key metrics that we were focused on. And it's important to say that the objective was not to try to provide answers about what any given particular team should do. Obviously, ultimately, any given individual team or company has its own particular objectives. They will know which element in the kind of interconnected system of their engineering team they need to optimize towards. And we certainly don't believe in one size fits all metrics, which everyone should employ and should kind of strive towards. What we were trying to achieve is to provide the first ever industry-wide and global CI/CD benchmarks for high-performing teams based on actual observed data. And the intention was really to help companies understand what to measure and how to measure it, but ultimately to try to build a framework for measurement and a culture of measurement within the business, and perhaps at a sort of more abstract level to catalyze an open exchange of ideas about what successful teams are doing and how other teams can learn from that. Specifically with regards to the UK software and the data that we saw, a couple of things stood out. One was throughput. Throughput's an interesting metric because, as I say, it's a good indicator of productivity. Ultimately, it's the volume of work that runs through the platform and the output that a software team produces. And the UK benchmarked incredibly highly against the global median. So the UK was actually over 80% higher in its output, in its throughput, than the global median performer on CircleCI. So that was a kind of good element to see. But set against that was the second metric, which really stood out, was success rate. Now, success rate is a really good indicator of how innovative you are as a company and how fast-paced your teams are in the way that they're operating. And fundamentally, if you're trying to move quickly and have a culture of innovation, you expect to see errors. You expect software engineers to ship code that isn't perfect. And in this regard, the UK actually was slightly unusual, a bit of an outlier, in that the success rate was actually over 95%, which is very unusual. We would expect to see most teams, and sort of aggregated to a company level, 50 to 60% success rate. At the end of the day, if your teams are spending too much time polishing and perfecting code before they push it to test, that probably means that you're not moving quick enough and not taking enough risk.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to kind of see those kind of figures come out, especially out of the UK, and obviously that was something that jumped out at me. So the most logical follow-up to that is, why do you think UK software developers are much more risk averse in comparison to other countries? We saw stuff like Germany was listed in there as well. Also, when it comes to this innovation, why is this happening all of a sudden?
I think there are some considerations which normally, when we talk to a lot of customers in varying markets, we work with customers across a whole host of different sectors, and indeed some of those companies are kind of software native tech companies, or more traditional businesses that have undergone some form of digital transformation at varying points in time. We get a lot of insight from those conversations, and I think some things could potentially stand out. One would be culture within the teams and within businesses in the UK. The data would suggest that given that level of success rate, individual teams and companies are very risk averse and are very worried about shipping code with errors. Perhaps equally, the operational processes within those teams are leaning towards control versus developer or team empowerment. Maybe a little kind of over focused on process and control versus empowerment in the individual developers and teams. That could be a suggestion that a high percentage of teams don't necessarily trust in automation and the coverage of their test suite within, for example, CircleCI's platform. You really should have a comprehensive and robust test suite, so that you can then trust in that test suite and enable your developers to ship change and ship code as frequently as possible, and really empower them to take risks and to move quickly. Another potential consideration specifically for the UK could be that we know that we have a lot of tech companies, particularly in the venture capital backed ecosystem, that operate in highly regulated spaces. So over the last 4 to 5 years, the top 3 sectors of venture capital investment are health tech, legal tech, and fintech. There could be potential regulatory requirements that require or kind of create a more conservative behavior within those teams. And perhaps a corollary to that would be that the kind of freewheeling growth at all costs kind of blitz scaling model that a lot of tech companies have operated in Silicon Valley hasn't always been the approach for teams building software in the UK and Europe. We've often focused much more on more of a sustainable growth model. And of course, that's tied to the fact that scaling a tech company within Europe is intrinsically quite difficult, because we're operating in smaller internal markets. Even the digital single market is more of an aspiration than a reality. And that, at a very early stage, a company needs to go international, to hit revenue and user growth goals, versus say in the US, where you have a very large market and you can scale very quickly without having to kind of regionalize or localize your business. And inherently, when you go cross-border and you deal with many different legal and regulatory systems, that adds more complexity to how you're operating, and perhaps more of a conservative approach to building the technology that you're building.
Yeah, completely. There's so many factors to consider, and obviously whenever we're talking about this stuff, it is dependent on your organization, your size, and your goals. And I think there's some good advice in there for each of those levels for how people kind of want to implement it. And it leads me nicely to my kind of last question here, to kind of, if we see this trend persist going forward we're early in the year, we could see what happens for the next kind of 10 months. What impact are these actions likely to have on the future of UK tech? And really, how can organizations within this region tackle their fear and better approach this transformation that we've been discussing?
IT is no longer managed by a team in the corner of your building, or often, no longer in another corner of the world as it used to be many years ago, and is increasingly core to most businesses, and is increasingly being managed by teams that are close to your, fundamentally close to your value building teams within the company. Mm-hmm. We've seen, we've only seen that accelerate over the last 12 months since COVID. In fact, just a couple of months ago, we saw that the FT produced a report on corporate change in technology, which really emphasized the fact that most large organizations now are experimenting with some form of innovation, whether that is within their own software teams, building innovation labs, or engaging in startup programs or corporate VC. It really, software development and modern software development practices are no longer just a kind of niche thing for Facebook or Google, or startups looking to emulate those sorts of businesses. That being said, given what we've seen in the data that we have, and given that just by using continuous integration and continuous delivery, CI/CD, that is a very good proxy for modern software development. So we're seeing, the companies that are using a tool like CircleCI should be some of the highest performing and most innovative companies, which is what makes it concerning that we see that risk aversion within UK's businesses in particular. I think, the second part to your question is, how can organizations adapt to both the kind of slowness of innovation, if that's kind of where they are, and the continuing complexity of building and managing software products. I think for me, there are three areas that would be front of mind. One is, to touch on, as we did earlier, culture. I think, you should be looking at an environment where you create a situation where it's okay to ship code with errors, and you want to empower your developers to take measured risks and to know that if they do make mistakes, that's okay. You want to encourage a culture of blame-free postmortems, and, depending on how advanced you are, find areas in which you can take some measured risks, whether that's with a particular team in your company, or maybe you're building a new app or product and you can experiment in doing that. The second area would be operations. So thinking about how you're actually operating your teams. Are you breaking things down into small pieces, smaller teams to manage those smaller kind of parts of your product? Trying to restrict outsourcing and bringing things back in-house and investing in your developer teams is certainly a good strategy. You definitely want to consider more automation to speed up your pace of software delivery, but invest in comprehensive test coverage and some modern tools and practices to make that happen. And ultimately, the third area I think is vitally important, and perhaps unsurprisingly, I would say this given the report that we published, but really trying to take a metrics-driven approach. So, thinking about modern monitoring, modern observability, modern measurement, using those modern tools to harvest data that's available. And really you want to define a framework for measurement, and baseline that within your business and within your teams, and then look to try to orient change within your business based on the particular measurements that you value and that are going to be most impactful for your company. And ultimately, the objective for any software team should be that you want to be in a deploy ready state really all the time, and that you want the decision to deploy a change to your product to be a business-led decision, so you can innovate quickly, respond to market conditions, and hopefully be ultimately more innovative as a company.
Yeah, which is the goal that everyone wants to achieve, and it's definitely within reach. It's just following these steps and coming up with that plan. So, Nick, all I can say is thank you for coming on today's episode, walking us through all of this, and giving your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone who took the time to watch this episode. We hope you took a lot away from this. If you'd like more information and of course to check out the report, then head over to CircleCI.com. You can also join the conversation at EM360 on Twitter and LinkedIn. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and for more great daily content, please head on over to EM360tech.com.